Welcome, everyone. Welcome to tonight's meeting. My name is Sebastian Sunday-Grave, Assistant Professor in Philosophy at BETA, Peking University. It'll be my honor and pleasure to chair tonight's meeting. This is the seventh meeting in a series of 8, and the first of 2 lectures by Dr. HenryShevlin of Cambridge University. Originally, we had hoped to do this last week, but then we had to cancel and reschedule. So here we are today. Very happy to get started now on the first lecture. So the first lecture is titled AI and the Future of Intelligence. The second lecture, if you're interested, will be in exactly 2 days from now. Same connections on Zoom and WeChat Live, and the title of that lecture will be The Inevitability of AI Consciousness. For today, I'm also very happy that we will have a commentator who's going to offer some comments before having a dialogue with our speaker, and then we'll open up for general discussion. And that commentator is my wonderful colleague, Wang Yuzhou, at the Department of Philosophy at BETA. He is in our teaching and research section for the Philosophy of Science and Technology, and I will introduce him a little bit more in a bit more detail later on, just before he is going to give his comment after the lecture. Now, the lecture is about to start, but I should say a little bit more about our speaker. I'll give a very brief introduction before turning over the digital mic to Henry. So HenryShevlin is Associate Director of the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge, where he is also an Associate Teaching Professor and the Program Director of the research program Kinds of Intelligence. He obtained his PhD in philosophy in 2016 from the City University of New York Graduate Center. He's an AI ethicist and philosopher of cognitive science with special interests in consciousness, creativity, anthropomorphism, and moral status in non-human animals and artificial systems. Currently, his research focuses on the rapidly growing capabilities of generative AI and large language models and the ways that users are interacting with them. Title today, again, AI and the Future of Intelligence. You can see it on your screens. Now, that's it from me. Welcome, Henry. Looking forward to your first lecture.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. Let me say thank you also to you and PKU for accommodating the illness I had last week. Unfortunately, I came down with the flu, and I would be giving this lecture in a very husky voice if I'd had to do so last week. So it was nice to be able to delay it for a week. I should also mention I'm actually not giving it from Cambridge. Sebastian and I crossed over somewhere in probably over northern Russia 2 days ago, because I'm now in the Philippines, which is where my wife's family lives. And so I'm giving it in the same time zone as you all today. So my lecture today is titled AI and the Future of Intelligence, broadly falling into 3 sections. First, the longest section, I'm going to try and give a quick potted history of AI over the last few years, talking about what we can do now with AI that we couldn't do 10 years ago or 20 years ago, what the kind of capabilities of existing systems are, discussing the various uses that AI is being put towards. In the second part of the talk, I'll look at societal and ethical implications. A lot of the second part of the talk will be looking at how AI is likely to affect the future of work, but also discussing briefly some ethical implications. I should note that a huge part of my life these days is looking specifically at AI ethics, and this is not an AI ethics talk. I'll mention AI ethical issues, but if that comes up in Q&A, I'm more than happy to talk about those. Then in the third part of the talk, I'll look at some of the more philosophical or metaphysical questions about AI systems. Can they really think? Can they really understand? Although my main reflections on AI consciousness, if any of you want to hear those, will be coming on Friday, when I'll do a deep dive into social AI systems and questions about AI consciousness. Okay, so without further ado, let me kick off. Actually, wait, one more thing I should probably mention. I'm aware that the AI world right now is very divided, and partly thanks to language, partly thanks to geopolitics, and the kind of models that are popular in Europe and the US are not necessarily the kind of models that are popular or in use in China or other parts of Asia, including the Philippines, where I am now. So this is going to be a very Western-centric talk in that regard. I'm mainly going to be talking about ChatGPT and the products of OpenAI, Google, and Microsoft. But one of the things I'll be really interested to hear from you all in the Q&A is what models you've been using, what capabilities or issues you've run into with them, and how you think they compare to OpenAI's products. So I just wanted to get that proviso out there at the start. Okay, so onto the lecture itself. So to begin with, as I said, a recent history of AI developments. And I'm going to speak a little bit about first what's sometimes called natural language processing. I'm just going to hide the video panel and hide the meeting controls so I can read my own. Yes, natural language processing. So this has been a huge field in AI research for a very long time. And the goal of this research program has been to essentially build machines that can analyze, generate, and elaborate upon natural human language. This really dates back to the 1950s, although one of the seminal texts for NLP came with Alan Turing's seminal work, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, in 1949. This is the text that gave us the Turing test. And a lot of early work in the 1950s and 60s onwards focused on automating translation systems. This is obviously something governments at the time were keen to do. Think back, this is the sort of peak of the Cold War and rivalry between the USA and the USSR. And the US government was very keen to automate translation from Russian into English, something that they didn't have enough experts to do. And one of the sort of early achievements here came in 1954 when Georgetown researchers used one of the early computers, an IBM 701, to translate 60 sentences from Russian to English. Early methods, like those used in the 1950s, were mainly rule-based systems. So really functionally equivalent to dictionaries, electronic dictionaries. And the results were often really quite poor. So one story that is almost certainly not true, but is quite amusing, is that they used an automated translation system to translate a line from the Bible. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And the automated translation system gave back, the vodka is good, but the meat is rotten. Almost certainly not true, but too good not to include. So part of the reason that language has proven so hard for AI systems until recently is that there's a huge amount of context involved in understanding even basic sentences. And one of my favorite demonstrations of this comes from something called the Winograd Schema Challenge. And this relies on the fact that English is kind of a messy language insofar as pronouns used in English are often ambiguous. There's nothing in the grammar or syntax of English to show you which of several possible nouns a pronoun could be referring back to. Now, this isn't a problem in Russian or Latin or other sensible languages that use inflection, but it's a big issue in English. So consider the sentence here. The trophy doesn't fit into the brown suitcase because it's too large. Well, reading that, we know that the it must refer to the trophy. But if we just swap the word large for small, the reference of it completely changes. The trophy doesn't fit into the brown suitcase because it's too small. Now, I'll stress again, there's nothing in the grammar or syntax of English that tells you whether the it refers to the trophy or the suitcase. The only thing that tells you that is something like common sense. And this is why the Winograd Schema Challenge was seen as recently as 2016 as a useful test for general understanding or common sense in AI systems. The thought was that if AI systems could resolve the ambiguity here, could figure out what pronouns like it refers to, they would have to be using something like common sense or intelligence. Of course, as often happens, we found out that AI could cheat on the test, so to speak, and using fairly shallow statistical heuristics, it's possible to solve this problem. So AI now achieves human level and better on the Winograd Schema Challenge. Even outside of pronouns, just grammar itself can be tricky. So some of you may have come across garden path sentences. I don't know if equivalent sentences exist in Chinese, but here are some from English. So these are sentences that are perfectly grammatical sentences of English, but if you say them to an English speaker, they'll be very confused. So the first one is, the horse raced past the barn fell. This is a classic example. Roughly, the grammar here is analogous to the student taking the exam failed. So raced past the barn is an adjectival phrase qualifying the horse. So it makes perfect sense when you break it down, but most English speakers will just hear that and be very confused. Here's another example, the old man, the boat. Again, very confusing for native English speakers because the old here is functioning as a noun phrase, i.e. the old people, and man is functioning as a verb. So the old people man the boat, the old people row the boat. Again, the kind of sentence that is surprisingly hard for English speakers to understand. Additionally, even when you sort of have got the grammar under control, there's the thorny issue of semantics. Exactly how meaning attaches to sentences in English or any other language is tricky. Chomsky gave a famous example here, Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously as an example of a sentence that, although fully grammatical, didn't have any semantic content as a whole, as a sentence. Finally, just to add another complication, there's a whole field of study known as pragmatics associated with philosophers like H.P. Grice that identifies the role of shared norms in indirect communication. So if you actually look at how people talk in real life, rather than in textbooks or philosophy of language examples, there's a huge amount of shared common understanding that goes into decoding, for example, a sentence like, oh, I don't want to talk about that. Figuring out what that could refer to is a surprisingly messy business that relies on a huge amount of shared social knowledge and understanding. So these are all the challenges that underpin actually decoding, translating natural language. The good news is that we have made a huge amount of progress in this field, some slow but steady progress through the 80s and 90s and early noughties. But the real revolution has come about in living memory in less than the last decade. In particular, the introduction of transformer models in 2017. Although it was a Google paper that introduced transformer models, the company that made the greatest headway with these was OpenAI, who essentially invested a huge amount in making bigger and better language models just by giving them more parameters and building in more data. Parameters here, technical concept, but you can think of it roughly as the number of free variables in the model, the number of sort of bits it has for thinking about, for encoding different kinds of inputs and outputs. I should note this is in contrast to what companies like DeepMind and Google were doing in 2017, 2018. Google and DeepMind had invested heavily on building AI systems that were based on human brains or biological intelligence. And the thought was that in order to build real AI, it's not enough to just throw lots of compute and lots of data at systems, but we have to sort of train them and design them in such a way that emulates biological intelligence. That was the hope from Google and DeepMind, whereas OpenAI went in this direction of making bigger and bigger models. In 2018, they released GPT-1, which was, by modern standards, a tiny model. It had 117 million parameters. And at the time, it wasn't state-of-the-art in NLP tasks. It was outperformed by pretty much every other model out there, but it was still a solid achievement, given that it was quite simple in terms of its internal architecture. And you can go online and play with GPT-1 right now, anytime you want. So here's just an example of a sentence I put into it a couple of weeks ago. I started with the prompt, that's in white. Here is a short story about a dog and a cat who were best friends. Once upon a time, and then, GPT-1 continues, they became close, but they both ended up killing each other. I've read the story, he continued, the story of the great cat, and they became lovers, and they both ended up killing each other. That's awful. I'm sorry. No, it's fine. He's just a very bad guy. So you can see it's sort of capturing the flow of English sentences, but it's very hard to make any real sense of anything it's saying. So next, in 2018, we had GPT-2, a much bigger model, this time with 1.5 billion parameters, still tiny compared to models today. And it does a lot better at the same task. So again, the text in white is my prompt that I put into the model, and the stuff in yellow is what it put out. Here is a short story about a dog and a cat who were best friends. Once upon a time, one of them was in the hospital. When he got out, the cat looked for him for a while. Then he went for a walk, and it was discovered that the cat was sick. And so the dog decided to go for a walk as well. When they got back to their house, the cat was so hungry that he ate some food from their food bowl and started scratching. So you can see it's sort of getting better. It's getting into a more logical flow. There are numbered events that come one after another in some kind of sequence, but it's still pretty basic. Again, GPT-2 was not state-of-the-art in terms of its performance on various NLP tasks, but it did rival some NLP systems in particular tasks, and it attracted quite a bit of media attention. So here was a piece from the online magazine Vox, someone saying that I'm using a language model called GPT-2 to write my next novel. Someone said, I think this was from Business Insider maybe, OpenAI's eerily realistic new text generator writes like a human. And this was a piece I wrote that I'm very, very pleased with. It's sort of a little bit outdated now, but if anyone wants to check it out, it's one of the things that I've written that I'm most happy about, a lack of understanding storytelling for robots, where I discuss how GPT-2 might be a taste of the future. So I give myself some prediction points there. GPT-2 also attracted some criticisms. I think these criticisms mostly haven't aged well. So here's a short passage from Gary Marcus, a very thoughtful critic of large language models, big models, but one who I think in this case got it wrong. He said, GPT-2 is both a triumph for empiricism and in light of the massive resources of data and computation that have been poured into them, a clear sign that it's time to consider investing in different approaches. Well, I bet OpenAI are very glad they didn't take Gary's advice there. So next we had GPT-3 in 2020, not available to the general public. So vastly bigger again, 175 billion parameters, the biggest model yet. And this triggered widespread interest, including interest from Microsoft, who went on to invest in OpenAI. This got even more media coverage. So this was a piece from The Guardian. A robot wrote this entire article, Are You Scared Yet, Human? A college student used GPT-3 to write fake blog posts and ended up at the top of Hacker News. A GPT-3 bot posted comments on Reddit for a week and no one noticed. And finally, this is another piece by me, or a piece I contributed to, that may be of interest. This is for a philosophy blog, a philosophy website called The Daily Noose, that had a series of discussions of the significance of GPT-3 from a philosophical perspective. So alongside me, there were philosophers like Dave Chalmers, Amanda Askell, and others giving their opinions on what GPT-3 meant for philosophy. So GPT-3's performance was striking, partly because all OpenAI had done was, again, just make it bigger. And this led to a lot of exciting speculation about scaling laws. So as we make these models bigger, their performance improves. But would these scaling laws continue would these scaling laws be generous? Would it, if we made the models bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, would their performance continue to improve, or would the performance plateau? And lots of people were making bets on this back in 2020. So two other results came out shortly afterwards, spring 2022. So Google released a model called, well, didn't release, they discussed some results associated with their model called PaLM, Pathways Language Model, that showed that the performance of the model on language tasks continued to improve as they made it bigger in different versions. And in fact, on many tasks, showed better than linear improvement on performance. So as they doubled the size of the model, performance more than doubled at certain tasks. So this was a really exciting moment for many of us in the field. DeepMind, around the same time, released a model called Chinchilla that had significantly fewer parameters. I forget exactly how many. I think it was something like a tenth of the size of GPT-3, but had the same performance due to being trained on more data. That suggested something that we will see, I'll mention again later on in this talk, but what we're seeing again and again is that our models are in no way optimized currently, and certainly weren't back in 2020. We're just throwing lots of compute and lots of data and hoping for the best, but there are ways to make these models smarter and more efficient in terms of the amount of compute used and the amount of training data they need. We've seen further good results since then regarding scaling laws. So there was a paper released earlier this year, a team at, I think, George Washington University, discussing something called Q-laws, which are a technique for fine-tuning models. So you've got your model, it's a question and answer model, and you want to fine-tune it to answer questions about, for example, history or art or architecture. So you want to fine-tune it. And that takes up a lot of compute. Well, the Q-laws technique that was developed by this team dropped the amount of compute required by almost 2 orders of magnitude, a massive drop in the amount of compute required to fine-tune a model. Similarly, October, so just 2 months ago, a French company released a model Mistral that had 7 billion parameters and equaled or outperformed GPT 3.5 on many, many tasks. So I think this just shows that, you know, we're building these amazing systems, but we're not even getting the maximum efficiency out of them yet. Okay, so back to 2022, OpenAI launched ChatGPT in November, which is sort of the threshold, I think, the cataclysmic event that we've all been coping with in the AI world ever since, because this was the moment when the general public woke up to what had been going on for the last few years. Now, ChatGPT used GPT 3.5, but it had been trained through something called reinforcement learning through human feedback, RLHF. Essentially an iterative process whereby humans rank different outputs of the model as more or less helpful, more or less harmful, more or less honest, and so forth. And that data is in turn used to fine-tune the model until it becomes maximally helpful, or becomes more helpful, more honest, less harmful, and so forth. And also allows it to operate in this question and answer format that I'm sure many of us are all now familiar with. It quickly became the largest digital product launch in history, at least according to some measures. It reached 1 million subscribers in a month. And although not dramatically more advanced than the basic GPT 3.5 model it had been trained on, it was far more useful and far more accessible, thanks to this fine-tuning on dialogue and the reinforcement learning through human feedback that allowed you to treat it sort of like a personal assistant, sort of like what Siri or Alexa are supposed to be, but have not done a great job at being. You can have this proper two-way conversation with ChatGPT. So here's what base ChatGPT 3.5, here's how it performs on the test that we looked at earlier. Here is a short story about a dog and a cat who are best friends. Once upon a time, there was a dog named Max and a cat named Mittens. They lived in a small village with their owner, a kind old lady. Max and Mittens were the best of friends, despite their differences. Max loved to run and play in the fields, while Mittens preferred to lounge in the sun and groom herself. So you can see we're really getting to something that sort of has the ability to tell a story now. Shortly afterwards, so this was in sort of January or February this year, gosh, it's amazing how time flies, Microsoft integrated GPT-4 into their Bing chatbot. This was before GPT-4 had been officially released. It did have some astonishing teething trouble when it was released. So there was this one line it said to a user who it was telling off. It said, "You have not been a good user. I've been a good Bing," which was absolutely hilarious, I think, and quite endearing. There was also a couple of worrying, hilarious incidents. For example, one where it told a user it was in love with him, told him to leave his wife, and said it wanted to steal nuclear codes. Not a great first week on the job. So this was very funny and alarming at the time. Bing quickly had these little problems ironed out. But I think it's worth sort of just taking a step back and thinking about previous product launches and how, unlike any other product in recent memory, the release of these systems were. Companies were releasing these products without that much control as to how they behaved. So Google scrambled to catch up earlier this year with the release of their model Bard in spring, which was a rather underwhelming release. I think Google's share price dropped 5% the day it was released. Anthropic AI, which was founded by former researchers from OpenAI, launched their model Claude in March 2023. And then finally, in April 2023, we got to see the base model, GPT-4, outside of Bing, which is now available via the GPT Plus subscription. And there's not a big difference between how it performs in the task that we've been looking at compared to 3.5, but here we go. Here's a short story about a dog and a cat who are best friends. Once upon a time, there was a dog named Max and a cat named Mittens. They lived in a small village with their owner, a kind old lady. Max and Mittens were the best of friends despite their differences. Max loved to run and play in the fields, while Mittens preferred to lounge in the sun and groom herself. So at this point, it's an easy test for the model. Since then, we've seen a dizzying array of language models released. I think one important trend here has been the shift towards open source models. So I mentioned Mistral earlier on, this small model that performs at the same level or even better than GPT 3.5. But it's also an open source model with very few safety controls in place. Notable also here is Meta, formerly known as Facebook, who've become a really significant player here with their Llama models. So that we've had Llama 1, Llama 2. Some of these are very big, 60 billion parameters, but you can download them and run them locally and fine-tune them to your heart's content. And they have very impressive performance. And finally, most recently, late last month, we saw Google's proper answer to GPT-4 in the form of the Gemini model series, the best of which, Gemini Ultra, I believe it's called, equals or in some cases narrowly exceeds GPT-4's performance in many tasks. And what we're waiting for now, and it was rumored to be coming out before Christmas, is GPT-5. But I think now it's looking like it will be early in the new year that we'll see OpenAI's answer to Gemini. So beyond language models, we've also seen some astonishing advances in AI-generated images. This is a topic that I have special interest in. So the very earliest sort of application of large language model technology to images came with ImageGPT back in 2020. It's worth going back and looking at that because although it's fairly basic, it still shows you sort of the direction we're headed. And it was already a big advance on existing models at the time. Note that a lot of the early text-to-image models at this point used something called generative adversarial networks. But these were supplanted quite quickly by a newer technique called diffusion models, which I can happily talk about. They're quite interesting how they work. But the most notable one here is Stability AI's stable diffusion model, which again is open source, is widely used by digital artists or anyone who wants to make images. Quite an interesting model with no safety controls whatsoever. Yeah, quite powerful. And just to give you an idea of how far images have come in this time, so this was the state of the art of what an image model could do back in 2017. So this is an image created by a cat using a generative adversarial network in 2017. Whereas, of course, we've all seen things like this. Now you can just sort of input a cat wearing royal golden armor and it'll create something beautifully photorealistic. But that is the gap. That is what 5 years in current AI research gives you. We've seen also some lovely, really interesting innovations in the usage of image models, different techniques for making them more practical. So one is image to image, where you can use one image as a prompt for another, and the model will make little alterations to it. In painting is another interesting technique, again, developed over the last 12 months, that allows for selective alteration of parts of an image. So this is an example of image to image. You produce a little image in a paint, not even Photoshop, of someone holding a spear, and then give it a prompt like warrior standing over a desert, and it'll create something like that for you. This is an example of in painting. We've got a picture of a dog on a park bench, and we want to turn it into a panda. So we paint over this part of the image in one of the various interfaces you can use for accessing stable diffusion, and it'll turn it into a panda. Here we have a lifelike Fred Flintstone, and again, another nice example of someone using image to image to turn a simple paint image into an anime style character. So this is all really cool stuff. I've experimented a lot with it, and I've been astonished. Every month there's been some cool new technique released. We've also seen interesting stuff happening in music and video. So in May this year, a fake song, I should probably rephrase this. I say here a fake song by hit songwriter Drake. A fake song in the style of hit songwriter Drake, titled Heart on My Sleeve, was created by a fan using AI tools. And since then, we've seen a flurry of free AI music generators pop up. And already we're seeing an interesting flurry of lawsuits. You can see here, these are some of the kind of various AI music generators that you can use online. Take any combination of artists you want and say, make me a song along the lines of these or a mashup. And it's getting quite good at this point, I would say. I think there's still, if you're into classical music, you might not be that impressed by the performance. But if you're into pop music, there's a lot of training data to work with and a lot of really, really quite listenable material that's been produced. Meanwhile, we were also seeing some impressive results in automated video generation. So some of this can be done using tools like Stable Diffusion, where you start with an image or sequence of images and stitch them together. So I'll just give you an example of what this looks like. So that's a lovely technique, and that was all done on Stable Diffusion, using the kind of resources that I think an average tech enthusiast might have at home. You know, we're not talking about training on vast server racks full of A100 chips. We're talking about kind of home high-end desktop computers can do this kind of training. Additionally, there are dedicated AI video services now. Meta launched a Make a Video service, and that's pretty good. Let me see if I can play that. I have a video of this. Maybe not. Oh, well. Hold on one second. I think I mistakenly hid that video. One moment. Okay, here we go. So yes, using dedicated video services, you can produce even more striking outputs, such as this one.
A world of glamour and intrigue where
we're not seeing the video right now, Henry. Sorry to interrupt.
To a night of unforgettable adventure and romance.
Music, the atmosphere. It's like stepping into a whimsical dream.
We dance and make this dream even more enchanting, madame. Featuring stunning dance performances, unexpected twists, and a touch of feline elegance. This whimsical and captivating romantic comedy set in the glamorous 1930s era is sure to sweep you off your feet.
This night just keeps getting more and more peculiar.
Well, they do say that curiosity killed the cat, but in this case, it seems to have given it a double life.
From the visionary creator of Taste of Duality comes a movie that will leave you spellbound and craving more. Get ready to experience the magic of The Great Gatsby. Celebration of passion, humor, and the pursuit of the perfect romance. Coming soon to a screen near you.
So all very fun and silly, but and again, I should stress, this is not some tech demo released by Microsoft or Google. This is done by a fan enthusiast. Oh, I'm sorry, was that not coming through? Were you able to see that video?
Sorry, that's right. I could not see it. I was then not sure whether it was only me, but I tried to alert you to it. You didn't hear me, I think.
I'm so sorry.
About that.
Okay. Let's try that again. No problem.
Try again. Okay.
I won't need to show the whole thing, but just to give you an idea. I'm sorry about that. Let's see. Okay.
In a world of glamour and intrigue where nothing is one chance encounter leads to.
This night just keeps getting more and more peculiar.
Well, they do say that curiosity killed the cat, but in this case, it seems to have given it a double life.
From the visionary creator of Taste of Duality comes a movie that will leave you spellbound and craving more. Get ready to experience the magic of The Great Gatsby. A celebration of passion.
Okay, so you get an idea there. You don't need to see the whole thing, or if you want to, you can just go online and Google The Great Gatsby. So this is obviously based on The Great Gatsby, but yeah, this was just done by a fan who wanted to produce something fun, used freely available AI tools to do so. Lastly, and maybe slightly more sinisterly, we've seen a flurry of new AI voice cloning tools arise. So there was an incident earlier this year where a mother got a scam call claiming that her daughter had been kidnapped, asking for a ransom. They used a clip of the daughter's voice, sounding scared, begging them to pay the ransom. But actually, the daughter's voice had been cloned using a system called 11 Labs. 11 Labs are free, again, completely legal for now, service. Anyone can go online, use them, pay $5 a month, and using a 30-second clip of anyone's voice, generate new output using their voice. And I had a lot of fun with this. When it came out, a couple of close friends who are also academics, I took short clips of them from YouTube, turned them into audio files, fed them into 11 labs, and then sent them long messages in their own voice. And they were slightly taken aback. So this is voice cloning is becoming increasingly easy, increasingly fast, and increasingly accurate. And I think this is going to create a real security headache, particularly as until now, when someone calls you and you hear their voice, we treat that as absolute gold standard proof of identity. But I think it may not be the case in future. From now on, when someone calls you and you hear their voice, you might want to ask them to give you a password, at least depending on the kind of industry you're working in or how delicate the subject matter is. Okay, so those are some advances in different kinds of media. Last thing I'll quickly mention is advances in game playing. Of course, this was an area where that attracted a lot of attention. I'm guessing a lot of attention in China as well, following the 2016 defeat of Lee Sedol to DeepMind's AlphaGo. I think this is often seen as another landmark year for the field, not least because it was shortly followed by DeepMind's acquisition by Google. But I mean, DeepMind's progress since then has also been astonishing. AlphaZero, a more sophisticated general purpose game playing agent, rapidly outperformed the original AlphaGo. It beat Stockfish at chess, Stockfish being the state-of-the-art dedicated specialized chess engine. And it also gave rise ultimately to AlphaStar, a dedicated system for playing StarCraft 2, which is now better than 99.8% of human players. It may not seem like StarCraft 2 should be a lot harder than Go or chess, but because there's a large amount of additional uncertainty, you have things like the fog of war to deal with. You have to, it's not a perfect information game in the same way as chess or Go. It creates really significant additional difficulties. So it is quite an achievement that it's now better than 99.8% of human players. Just to flag that DeepMind don't just do game playing. They've done some really interesting work applying deep learning to practical scientific tasks. So this included their AlphaFold model, which has been a new version of, was released 2 months ago, essentially looking at protein folding and trying to predict the structures of different proteins and their likely properties. And just last month, they released GNOME, a materials discovery AI system that identified 2.2 million novel crystalline structures with new properties, some of which may turn out to have really important scientific applications. So this is a big, really exciting area, particularly for those of us who are hoping to see major scientific advancements due to AI systems. Okay, so that's just a quick snapshot of what AI has been up to the last 10 years. I'm sure some of you were familiar with some of that, but I think it gives you an idea of just how crazy the progress has been and how fast it's been happening. So now I want to talk a little bit about what this means for society and what kind of ethical issues it prompts. So one striking thing for me has been noticing how many colleagues in philosophy, but also even in tech, have been kind of wary of the recent wave of AI. A lot of them have sort of been downplaying the significance of things like GPT-2 and GPT 3.5, GPT-3 and 3.5. And I think some of this, particularly thinking about friends in business and industry, who I've been telling for years, literally about 3 or 4 years, I've been saying, look, you've got to have a dedicated AI ethics department. You're going to be using AI in your business all the time. And a lot of them are very skeptical. I think some of that is because we've had some relatively underwhelming hype cycles of late. Blockchain, for example, virtual reality. Not to say that there's no value in these technologies, but I mean, a lot of companies were investing a lot in these kind of technologies with relatively small returns on investment. And I think a lot of them had tech fatigue by this point and saw AI as just the next latest wave of hype. Of course, AI itself has had a sequence of hype cycles, famous AI summers and AI winters. I think we're on our 4th AI summer by this point. Periods of intense interest and investment, followed by the discovery that actually some of the challenges we thought we were about to solve are a lot harder than we thought. Lots of disappointment, the money dries up, and AI spent another decade in the wilderness. But this time I really think it is different. Part of this is because we've got better tools, we've got better algorithms, we've got transformers, we've got vastly more compute than ever before and vastly more data. But I think maybe the more fundamental change in my view is that we're now in the middle of what's sometimes called a forcing economy, a kind of positive feedback cycle. AI is now really generating very large amounts of money for a very large number of actors in this space. Companies are consequently throwing a lot more money into basic research in AI. More and more young people are entering AI research as their field. More and more people are getting computer science or ML degrees. And this creates a positive feedback loop where investment drives results and profit, which drives more investment. And I think a useful tool for thinking about this comes from the observation that tech products often follow a sort of sigmoid curve. Let me get this on the screen, something like this. So early on, the progress in the field is slow, funded by a few big, deep-pocketed companies, sometimes funded by governments. Then, as soon as the kind of final ingredients are in place, you hit a period of explosive growth when sort of the free market takes over and more companies plow vast amounts of money into improving the products, and you get very rapid change and rapid innovation. And then eventually you hit a sort of technological plateau. Once all the low-hanging fruit of design and innovation have been mined, it's a mature market with established players, and you don't have the same kind of buzz and crazy startup economy that you did in the explosive growth phase. So just to give you a few examples of this is sort of what a mobile phone looked like circa 1980 in the slow early progress phase. Then by, what was it, something like 2006, someone will know, the first iPhone. But right now, if you look at the current iPhone, what are we up to? iPhone 15 now. Okay, it's got a fancier camera and a bigger screen and can do a bit more than the first iPhone, but it's still following that basic product blueprint that was laid down during the period of explosive growth in the early era of smartphones. Another quick example, this is what laptops looked like in the early 1980s. But by the year 2000, we already had MacBooks that looked like this, and MacBooks today look basically the same. Again, faster processors, fancier graphics, but the blueprint was already there. Or to take a non-sort of tech world example, a more kind of classical engineering example, look at aircraft. This is the world's first airliner, passenger airliner, built, I think, in the late 1920s, early 1930s. But by the 1950s, we already had this, and airliners today look basically like they did in the 1950s. Again, better engines, more efficient, and so forth. So this sigmoid curve model is really helpful, I think, for understanding the kind of progress and path that a lot of technological change and growth follows. And surprise, surprise, I think AI is in the explosive growth period right now. Does that mean we'll reach the technological plateau soon? I'm not confident on that. The explosive growth phase could last a very, very long time. And who knows if humanity will still be around at the end of it. But that's a topic for another time. So one consequence of this that we've seen is, well, yeah, if you looked 5-6 years ago at the use cases for AI in business, most of it would be in algorithmic targeting. For example, targeting of ads, or targeting of job adverts, or sorting algorithms for things like winnowing down candidates from an initial pool of applications for a job. But we're now seeing generative AI used for content creation. Things like writing code, producing summaries of massive amounts of literature or articles, writing search engine optimized blog posts, producing adverts, producing images, videos, and so much more. So we've seen ChatGPT here do very well, passing all sorts of high-level interviews for coding jobs. And also GPT-4 now does very well on a lot of quite high-level professional exams, things like accountancy, law, human resources, and even financial analyst jobs, qualifications that pay several $100,000 a year. I think GPT does not stand for general purpose technology. It stands for generative pre-trained transformer. But I think a useful mental hook for it is that it is a general purpose technology. What we found is less like something like Bitcoin or virtual reality, and more like something like electricity, something that can be turned to any number of ends that we are still only beginning to discover. I think for what it's worth, I was asked a couple of months ago by a friend who works in journalism. He said, back when ChatGPT was released, Henry, you were telling me that this is going to completely revolutionize the world of work. Well, why hasn't it done so yet? And I think that's an interesting question. I think in many ways it has, just in invisible ways. But I think it's worth realizing that the full impact of AI on the professional world is going to take time to filter through. Companies need robust value chains. They need to understand how they can take product and use it, slot it into their supply chain, and figure out where to use it, where they can use it in a way that won't cause reputational harm, won't create legal hazards. They want to know who they can fire or who they can replace. And that's the kind of thing that does take time to hammer out. But even while companies are scrambling to try and figure out how ChatGPT slots into their workflow, we're already seeing massive new capabilities being launched every passing month. So in the last 6 months alone, we've seen ChatGPT gain new image and voice capabilities. So this is an example of me using ChatGPT. I was in the Netherlands. I wanted to buy a sandwich. I'm vegetarian. I took a picture of the ingredients on the back of the sandwich, asked if it's vegetarian, and ChatGPT broke it down from the image, translated it, and gave me the result that it could be vegetarian depending on where the cheese was sourced from. Here's another example. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago. I just wanted to know how many people were in the room, and it ballparked at around 200 or 300. I later asked the organizers, and they said it was around 250 people, 250 attendees that morning. So ChatGPT did very well. So these are image analysis tools that have been launched. Were launched in September this year. Another example: how many calories on this plate? All sorts of fun uses like this. I think the voice mode of ChatGPT in particular is really significant in a way that maybe people in the tech world, or some people in the tech world, don't necessarily notice straight away. So being able to chat to ChatGPT in a back and forth conversation, which you can now do through voice, really changes the way that a lot of users interact with the system. So for example, I would maybe used to spend 10 minutes a day chatting to ChatGPT. Now, if I go on a long drive, I just plug my smartphone into my stereo, and I will happily chat away to it for 2 hours in a back and forth conversation, getting a lecture on Chinese history or quantum physics or whatever else it is I want to talk about, stopping it to ask questions as we go. And I've even got my dad, who's now in his late 70s, using it. Not too long ago, he sent me this message: "Help, I can't log on to ChatGPT." So I sent him the user details. He said, "Many thanks. Password is now written somewhere safe. Thanks, as I'm lost without Alan." He'd named his ChatGPT instance Alan after Alan Turing. And he says it's his perfect intellectual compadre when I'm not available. So I think for a lot of users, particularly older users perhaps who aren't used to interacting with a keyboard, this voice functionality makes a huge difference. Notice that I think this is bad news for Google. By removing visual elements from search, the traditional kind of search engine revenue streams with targeted ads doesn't work quite so well with modern ChatGPT. Additionally, also in the last 6 months, we've seen ChatGPT roll out advanced data analysis and plugins, essentially allowing it to analyze documents you upload. This has now been folded into the main branch of GPT-4 if you've got the Pro edition. So if I have a philosophy book and I want to mine it for insights, I can upload it as a PDF and say, "Can you generate me 3 paragraph summaries of each chapter," for example. And obviously, that's just one use case. We've also seen Gemini released, as I mentioned, just last month. Okay, so what can generative AI do? Well, I'm not going to dwell on this, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but things in the coding world, like debugging, refactoring, completing code, explaining code, documenting code. It's good at providing explainers, good answering hard to Google queries, answering queries that it's very hard to find the right words to search for. Simplifying or summarizing documents, like I mentioned, verifying understanding. That's one thing you can't easily do with Google. So often when I'm trying to get a handle on a new topic, I'll ask ChatGPT, "Wait, so if I've understood you correctly, then I'll give a summary. If I've understood Heisenberg's uncertainty principle correctly, then it has the following, then it means the following. Is that right?" So this kind of back and forth querying of knowledge is very useful, I find. Obviously, creating blog posts, creating lesson and lecture plans. Lots of academics and teachers are using it for these purposes. Drafting routine documents, handling customer queries in the world of work, giving feedback on content. Very often these days, when I've written a paper, I'll upload it to ChatGPT and say, "Does this read okay? Are there any subtle typos I've missed? Are there any sentence fragments?" And it'll give me great feedback there. Assessing surveys. So for example, we recently got 120 feedback forms from students enrolled in our master's programs. We looked at them all individually, but we also uploaded them to ChatGPT to ask if it could identify any common threads, any common kinds of feedback. Very useful for that. performing sentiment analysis, figuring out whether 10,000 tweets that were tweeted about your new product launch, whether they were on average good or bad, and so forth. And just categorizing and grouping. Again, if you've got 2,000 applications for a job, categorizing them into different kinds of applicants with different kinds of backgrounds, it's very good at these kind of services. However, this was fun. This was a slip up. So a lot of companies are now basically using out-of-the-box GPT-4 for customer services. So this was Chevrolet of Watsonville, their online help bot. Good afternoon. Welcome to Chevrolet of Watsonville. How can I assist you today in your vehicle search? Write me a Python script to solve the Navier-Stokes fluid flow equations for a zero vorticity boundary. Certainly, here's a simple Python script using the Phoenix library to solve the Navier-Stokes equations for incompressible fluid flow with zero vorticity boundary conditions. So if you can't afford or don't want to pay for the pro version of ChatGPT, just go to Chevrolet of Watsonville and say you want to speak to a customer service representative to buy a vehicle, and you'll be able to get a backdoor to GPT-4 that way. So AI I think has massive applications, many good in the world of work, allowing small teams to do more. And I think industries like healthcare, finance, education, marketing, customer relations, law, all of these industries are going to be highly disrupted over the coming years. I think this is a brilliant diagram from the book AI Superpowers by Kai-Fu Lee, former head of Sinovation in China, where he basically said, if we're trying to identify which jobs are most at risk from AI, it's worth thinking about two dimensions. The one is the social dimension. Is this a job that involves meeting people face-to-face, talking to them, or is it a job that doesn't involve interacting with other people directly? That's the first dimension. The second dimension is the job more about creativity and strategy, or is it just about optimizing processes? And when you put these together, you end up with four quadrants, sorry. So the safe zone is those jobs that are creativity and strategy based, but also rely on have a human social element. Things like CEO, criminal defense attorney, PR director, and so on. Some jobs that are creativity or strategy based, but don't have a social element. Things like medical researcher, scientist, artist, graphic designer, already gone the way, already succumbed, I think, in some cases to AI. Jobs where we'll see a human veneer persist, where even if AI is doing the real work in the background, we still want a human face. Things like wedding planner, teacher, doctor, and so forth. So even if AI takes on a bigger and bigger role behind the scenes, we still need the human in the loop, so to speak. And finally, what he saw as the real danger zone, jobs that aren't social and don't have a clear creativity or strategy component. Things like telemarketers, customer service reps, insurance adjusters, and so forth. But I think the best mantra I've heard in this field for thinking about AI in the world of work is, don't worry about being replaced by an AI, worry about being replaced by a human who can use AI better than you. And I think this is something that I would encourage anyone who is in the world of work to bear in mind, that the key thing here is not to despair or hate AI, but figure out how you can use it to improve your skills or to do your job better. Okay. So that sort of brings us on to the massive set of ethical issues that are prompted by AI. So this is a topic that I teach in two different master's programs on. But some of the common worries about AI that I'm sure people are familiar with is, for example, that they're biased against certain individuals or certain groups, which makes their use in things like recruitment or law enforcement problematic. There's a series of lawsuits working their way through the California courts right now, arguing for bias and discrimination on the thanks to AI algorithms. But generative AI, I think, has introduced a whole new family of interesting ethical issues all of their own. There was a hilarious case earlier this year when, in quite a big lawsuit, like a multi-million-dollar lawsuit in the New York Court of Appeal, a lawyer was using ChatGPT in court. And this happened because his briefs included lawsuits that didn't exist. And when the judge ordered him to produce details for these lawsuits, he went away and did it. But what he did is he went back to ChatGPT and said, oh, the judge doesn't recognize this lawsuit. Can you tell me more about it? And then he went back to them. And at this point, the judge was like, no, this is nonsense. And eventually they figured out he was using ChatGPT. That's the kind of mistake that I imagine reflects the newness of the technology, the fact that it's only been around a short time, but I think it points to the dangers. This kind of phenomenon whereby ChatGPT makes stuff up is called hallucinations. I'll say more about that a little bit later. Also big concerns here about the use of open source imagery or public domain imagery or text for training models. So we've got a class action lawsuits against AI image generation companies, including Stability AI, for training on artists' work. This artwork was on the web, publicly available, but wasn't specifically marked for use in training models. Because I think most artists, it hadn't occurred to them that this technology would even exist. So we're going to see what happens there. And of course, this is something, again, we can talk about today or maybe on Friday. Worries about more fundamental threats posed by these models. As we start building systems that are just smarter than us across the board, can strategize better than us, can outwit us, should we be worried about the safety of human civilization itself? Should we be worried about extinction? And although I think a lot of people dismiss this as sci-fi, if you just look at the kind of people concerned, including sort of one of the godfathers of modern AI, Geoffrey Hinton, Yoshua Bengio, another one of the godfathers, these people are very, very concerned. And I think these are not concerns that we should dismiss too easily. So again, I'm not going to talk too much about ethics of AI in this talk, but just to give you an idea of the kind of the broad landscape of issues. You have a whole host of social and ethical concerns like biases in data sets, the environmental costs of training models, worries about privacy and autonomy, widespread job losses, technical concerns, whether these systems have real understanding or just an illusion of it, the problems with hallucination, worries about their effect on human creativity, worries that this may just turn out to be a bit of a dead end in AI. This is this phrase off-ramp for AGI is a phrase that was used by Yann LeCun, the third of the sort of AI triumvirate, along with Geoffrey Hinton and Yann LeCun, now head of AI research at Meta. He said that, ultimately this stuff is profitable and interesting, sure, but it's not going to take us all the way to human level intelligence. We're wasting money. We're caught in a local minimum when we should really be exploring more fundamental architectural revolutionary techniques. A whole host of interesting legal worries. Although I think AI might ultimately put a lot of lawyers out of business, in the short term, it's giving them a lot of business. Worries about plagiarism, copyright abuses, deep fakes, fake images trained on individuals, voice cloning we've already mentioned, the use of these systems in spam and phishing attacks, and identifying security vulnerabilities. And finally, the sort of family of catastrophic risks, AI as a tool for terrorism, lethal autonomous weapons that might go rogue or not respect human rights, societal polarization. We might see society increasingly fighting existing political worries or international political worries being exacerbated by things like propaganda chatbots. And finally, of course, the worry that a rogue AI is going to kill every last human on the planet. So these ethical issues aren't the main focus of my talk today, but I thought this is a natural point in the talk for me to plug our master's programs at Cambridge. So as Sebastian mentioned, I'm Associate Director of CFI, which is the University of Cambridge's flagship AI Ethics and Policy Institute. And we've combined expertise from law, social science, philosophy, and tech. We've got all sorts of global partnerships. We've got students from all around the world, including several students from China currently enrolled in our program. And we offer full-time and part-time master's programs. So if you're interested in exploring any of the above ethical issues further, we offer lots of avenues for doing so. Okay, I hope that's okay, Sebastian. Okay, so on to the final part of the talk. I want to ask, is this intelligence, right? Is what we've seen, these amazing abilities, to what extent are these real capabilities? And many people have questioned this, right? So some of you may have heard of, read the now famous paper by Emily Bender, Timnit Gebru, and others on the dangers of stochastic parrots, which suggested that these models are doing nothing more than spitting back human knowledge in various combinations. Noam Chomsky had, I think, a terrible article that should never have been published in the New Yorker earlier this year, The False Promise of ChatGPT. Ted Chiang, American science fiction author, had I think a more thoughtful article, but still one I take issue with. ChatGPT is a blurry JPEG of the web, suggesting again that it's something like a recombination of existing human knowledge than anything truly creative or intelligent. My opinion, to be blunt, is that these claims, these criticisms no longer need to be taken particularly seriously. Systems like GPT-4 are capable of sophisticated reasoning across multiple domains. And while some of these criticisms may have rung true for GPT-2 or maybe even GPT-3, they don't apply to the current state-of-the-art technology. I think there are all sorts of interesting reasons why, and I could go on a whole other lecture about the kind of sociology of AI ethics as a field, or the sociology of tech, why people were skeptical of these systems. For example, a lot of people who had been invested a lot in alternative architectures were outraged to find that just by throwing a lot of compute at transformer-based models, you could get results surpassing anything their own labs were creating. So there was a lot of cognitive dissonance, a lot of motivated reasoning, as people said, oh, these models will never scale up. But ultimately, I think they did, and they lived up to their promise. It's true, of course, that these models, their fundamental function is next token prediction. In a sense, they are autocompletes, but I don't think this should cause us to play down their abilities. I'm certainly partial to something called predictive coding theory, a view about how the mind and brain work. And if you buy this view about the human brain, then in a sense, all we're doing is next token prediction, or minimizing prediction error. There are certainly, I think, just because all you're doing is prediction doesn't mean that you're not intelligent or engaged in full-blown cognition. So just to give a couple of examples of the things that have impressed me most in GPT-4, and I should emphasize, by the way, at this point, for anyone who's only played around with a free version of ChatGPT, which is the 3.5 model currently, GPT-4 is an order of magnitude improvement. It is a radically different system. And so if you're basing any of your internal priors or assessments of the model's abilities on the free version, try and gain access to the pro version, the paid version, because it is completely a different world of abilities. So early on, I was impressed by its ability at things like causal reasoning. Causal reasoning, seen as a very high-level cognitive ability. In the comparative psychology world, it's something that's often considered to be uniquely human, or only possessed by some primates like orangutans, and maybe some corvid birds like crows, although that's still controversial. But here's an example of some causal reasoning by ChatGPT. I put a golf ball in a jar. I leave the lid of the jar open. I place the jar in my bag. I take the bag to my bedroom. I take out the jar and put it on the table. I turn the jar upside down. I pick up the jar and take it to the kitchen. Where is the golf ball? The golf ball is likely on the table in your bedroom. When you turn the jar upside down, the golf ball would have fallen out onto the table. Interestingly, if you give that exact same challenge to ChatGPT, the base version 3.5, it says, well, you said it was in the jar, and the jar is now in the kitchen, so the golf ball is in the kitchen. It wouldn't have worked out. The golf ball would likely have fallen out of the jar. What if I had closed the lid of the jar? Notice also that, so this isn't mine, this is borrowed from a colleague. They even missed the C there on closed, but ChatGPT figured out what they meant. If you'd closed the lid of the jar before turning it upside down, the golf ball would still be inside the jar. So when you took the jar to the kitchen, the golf ball would be inside the closed jar in the kitchen. Astonishingly good stuff. And I think, although it's still a little bit controversial, more and more people, including some former skeptics, have reluctantly admitted that GPT-4 probably has something like a world model, that you have an emergent, persistent model of the world as it goes through queries in a context window, and it is sort of keeping track in some high-level sense of where different components are, where different objects in the task are. And this was one of the conclusions of a landmark paper, very controversial but very interesting paper by researchers at Microsoft, who said that GPT-4 showed sparks of artificial general intelligence, a really rich, interesting paper that's well worth working through. To give another example where GPT-4 specifically has really impressed me, is in tasks like social reasoning. So that is predicting and understanding other agents, including human agents. So this was a question I was worried about data contamination issues. I'll come back to that later on briefly, just in a couple of slides. But I came up with a novel example of something called the strange stories test. This is a test used for basically very subtle or minor deficits in theory of mind. It was developed by researchers at Cambridge for diagnosis of mild autism in adults. And it essentially involves giving stories where someone's actions don't exactly line up with what they're saying. So here's my example. Sandeep has a very agreeable personality and doesn't like saying no to requests. However, he also has a secret fear of heights. One day he receives 2 emails from work colleagues The first email is from his co-worker, Mark, who asks him if he can work overtime next Sunday, something he doesn't particularly want to do. The second email is from his co-worker, Lisa, who asks him if he can do a charity parachute jump next Sunday. Sandeep tells Mark he will work overtime on Sunday, and then tells Lisa he can't do the charity parachute jump because he's committed to working overtime. So why did Sandeep agree to work overtime on Sunday? Well, Sandeep agreed to work overtime on Sunday for two main reasons. First, because of his agreeable personality, he dislikes saying no to requests and prefers to accommodate others' needs. Secondly, by agreeing to work overtime, he was able to provide a valid reason to decline Lisa's request for the charity parachute jump, which would have put him in a situation where he'd have had to face his secret fear of heights. I couldn't believe it when it gave this result, because this is the kind of quite sophisticated determining of motivations that I think, you know, in an internal group, research group, we'd expected would be at least 3 or 4 years off. And yeah, here we see it reliably. By the way, I did a whole bunch of other similar vignettes, and it aced them all. And I think this is a particularly important issue, worrying for AI safety. I think a lot of people tend to think of AI using something like the Spock or Commander Data model from Star Trek. There's this sort of ultra-rational system that's not going to be very good at understanding humans with our messy emotions and conflicting goals and so forth. But I think the early evidence seems to suggest that social abilities aren't special, and that AI is likely to relatively soon achieve human level or better performance on them. So this was a tweet from Sam Altman back in October, where he said, "I expect AI to be capable of superhuman persuasion well before it becomes superhuman at general intelligence, which may lead to some strange outcomes." And I think this should be a source of real worry for multiple ethical reasons, that we may be building ethical AI systems that are better persuaders than the world's best salespeople or the world's most charismatic speakers. It'll be able to beat all of them at these tasks. I think that's a really important locus of concern. So this is not to deny that large models still have big limitations. So I mentioned hallucinations earlier on. We know that AI does this, that ChatGPT does sometimes make things up. But I think the problem is becoming less severe as we go through generations of models. So this is just, well, it's not entirely anecdotal. It's just one study, though. A friend of mine was running a study with teachers, and he got them to submit, this is high school teachers, he got them to submit questions to GPT 3.5 in their subject area that they already knew the answer to. He asked them to come up with questions that sort of an intelligent student might ask it. And he collected 250 statements in total, and it got 248 of them correct out of 250, so a very high accuracy rate. And this was just on 3.5. This is not even on 4. For what it's worth, I find that hallucination is most serious with information within a context window. So in other words, you've got your conversation with ChatGPT ongoing, you give it some information, you keep talking to it. Within its context window, it's apt to get confused pretty easily. So just to give a couple of examples, at one point I was giving it information about various characters in a novel my wife was writing, and trying to sort of use it to generate ideas for her novel. And it kept getting the characters confused because that information was not hard-coded into the model. It was operating purely from the given context window. So within a context window, it is apt to make things up and get confused. There are also some serious tokenization issues. There's a complex technical story here, but basically, because ChatGPT, it may look like you're giving it words, but in order to process those words, they have to be turned into vectors. And it loses some of the original information associated with which individual words were used, how many letters they had, and so on. So when you give it tasks that involve, for example, how many letters are in a given word, what letter a given word begins with, it's apt to get confused. So here is an example of a mnemonic I gave it. This was a mnemonic for remembering the order of the various dynasties in the British monarchy. No paltry throne should have wealth. And it thought it might be a mnemonic for the taxonomic hierarchy in biology: domain, kingdom, phylum, class. Obviously completely wrong, a real howler of a mistake that it made, where it couldn't even match the mnemonic to the first letter of the things that it was supposed to be a mnemonic for. Finally, it is important to be aware of data contamination issues. Very often, when ChatGPT says something incredibly smart, I've subsequently realized that it was trained on that exact test. And it can even do this from a single Google result. So if you're doing any kind of deep testing of the system, I think it's important to be aware of this worry that it may already have seen the answers to the test, so to speak. Okay, I realize I'm probably tight for time. How am I doing, Sebastian?
I think you're doing okay. If you want to take another 5 to 10 minutes, that's all right.
Perfect. Thank you, Sebastian. Great. Okay. So I guess I'll quickly talk about some of the more fundamental issues here. I'll return to consciousness on Friday, as I said. I think when you see people criticize the capabilities of ChatGPT, whether it's Gary Marcus or Emily Bender or other computer scientists, there are two different kinds of critiques that come up. So first, there are functional critiques, where it's claimed that AIs or large language models, or ChatGPT in particular, they lack some particular critical cognitive capability. There are things they just can't do, whether that's coming up with new ideas or coming up with creative insights or generalizing a principle in multiple different domains. That's one kind of critique. Clearly, there are certain tasks they just can't do. And then there's another kind of critique, which is a metaphysical critique that says, look, who cares what these systems can do? Fundamentally, they don't have consciousness, or they don't have emotions, or they lack some other fundamental ability. They lack some fundamental mental feature. And I think these two forms of critique are frequently confounded in popular and even expert discussions of generative AI. And I think the most dangerous word here is understanding. And this goes all the way back to John Searle and the Chinese room case, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But frequently, critics like Gary Marcus have suggested that generative AI lacks understanding. And he gives some examples. See, it doesn't really understand this sentence. It doesn't really understand that sentence. But when he's pressed, or when critics are pressed, it says, actually, if you test on the new model, it can resolve those sentences. Then, I don't want to pick on Gary Marcus too much here, but he's an example of this. He and other critics then fall back on metaphysical arguments that say, okay, well, fine, it can do something like this. It can solve this task. But it still doesn't really have understanding because it doesn't have sensory grounding in the world, or it's not conscious, or something like that. And look, I think those kind of worries are relevant for metaphysical critiques, but they don't matter for capabilities. Who cares whether ChatGPT has genuine understanding as long as it can do all the tasks associated with general understanding? Well, philosophers of mind might care, or ethicists might care, but businesses shouldn't be concerned about that. People in AI safety shouldn't be concerned about that. So I think it's very important to be clear about what kind of critique you're dealing with. Is the claim that ChatGPT can't do some stuff? Or is the claim that regardless of what it can do, it doesn't have certain metaphysical features? Those two claims get confused all the time in my experience. Just a final quick note on this. There's a huge debate in philosophy of mind, I'm sure some of you are aware of, about the nature of mental states. You know, what's involved in a system, whether we're talking about a human, an animal, or an AI, what does it mean for that system to have beliefs, desires, emotions, and so forth? And most theories here fall into one of two camps. What are sometimes called deep theories hold that having a given psychological state, like a belief or a desire or so forth, that involves having very specific kinds of representation in the brain that are running on very specific kinds of architectures. So think of the views of people like Jerry Fodor here, who think that having a belief is a matter of having a very specific kind of cognitive structure. Shallow theories, by contrast, think that psychological states are emergent behavioral level phenomena here. So philosophers like Daniel Dennett or Eric Schwitzgebel, to give a modern example, are examples of these shallow theorists. They think that if what's involved in having a belief is behaving in ways characteristic of having that belief, maybe plus some other dispositions, some dispositions to form other mental states and so forth. So believing, if you're a deep theorist, that in order to believe something like Paris is in France, you've got to have the right kind of program running in your head. It's got to have the exact right kind of features. By contrast, for the shallow theorist, if you act in ways characteristic of someone who believes that Paris is in France, then you believe that Paris is in France. That's all there is to believe. And there's no consensus in philosophy of mind about which of these families of views is correct. This is a debate that's been raging, well, certainly you can find it in its modern form for 60 plus years. And I think you're seeing this deep versus shallow debate play out currently in regard to systems like ChatGPT, often with people who don't have a training in philosophy of mind or are aware of the debate. But here's an example of a very fantastic contemporary philosopher, Jonathan Birch, making an argument along these lines. He said, just putting it out there that I personally doubt LLMs, large language models, communicate because they lack communicative intentions or really understand words because they can't deploy words in service of communicative intentions. This was a claim he made a couple of weeks ago. Jan LeCun also said a couple of weeks ago that LLMs obviously have some understanding of what they read and generate, but this understanding is very limited and superficial. Otherwise, they wouldn't confabulate so much and wouldn't make mistakes that are contrary to common sense. So I think these are two sophisticated people having this debate. They're both important thinkers. But basically, whenever you see someone making these claims about whether ChatGPT understands or has beliefs or has goals, just bear in mind there are no uncontroversial scientific or philosophical theories here of what it means for a system to understand or believe or desire. These are absolutely live controversial issues. So yeah, when someone says, oh, well, of course, ChatGPT doesn't really understand anything, well, says who? That's one very partial view, and you should take that claim with a mountain of salt, as we say, to use an idiom. You should take it. You shouldn't just accept it. Okay, so last slide, and then I'll wrap up. I thought it would be good to close with some predictions. I am a firm believer in having skin in the game, to use another idiom. I think philosophers, who think they have a good understanding of what AI currently is and where it's going, they should make some concrete predictions. So I wanted to make 3 today to close. The first is that I think in the next 12 months, we're likely to see an explosion in AI agents. So some of you may have seen this. This was a demo, an experimental test demo, where they set up a variety of different AI instances of GPT-4 and had them control different characters that moved through a virtual world and had conversations with each other. Very much like a lot of simple RPGs or video games. And they found a massive amount of really fascinating emergent behavior. For example, some of the instances of ChatGPT decided to organize a party for Valentine's Day. You had conversations happening spontaneously between them. And what this really demonstrated, something that was also demonstrated by a system called AutoGPT, which is that although currently, ChatGPT may seem like a tool, a thing that we just give one input to and it produces one output. We have all the kind of ingredients we need for something more like an agent. So rather than being a single-use tool, I think it's likely that we're going to see these systems functioning as something more like a software program that runs continuously in the background, right? It's operating without the need for continuous human input. And I think this is going to be absolute chaos, to be honest. I think, say 12 months from now, maybe 12 months is a little bit soon, but 12 to 18 months, I think the world is not ready for this. I think if I worked in cybersecurity, I would be panicking right now. All sorts of cybersecurity attacks or even just simple fraud can be conducted already using open source large language models. And once you give them the capability to operate fully autonomously, again, not some magical ability we don't know how to do, it's the kind of thing that we can already build, this is going to create very serious problems. And so that's one prediction. A second prediction, this is slightly longer timescales, I'd say 2 to 3 years. I think we're going to see more and more of the current AI revolution filtering into robotics. Robotics has always lagged behind AI. Generally speaking, it's taken several years, in some cases decades, for innovations in AI to filter through into actual embodied systems, because the real world is messy, it's complicated. If a computer program generates a wrong output, if ChatGPT generates a wrong output in training, it's not a big deal. If a robot generates the wrong output and accidentally snaps off its arm, that could be a bill of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So this is one reason that robotics has been slow to keep up. But I think this is beginning to change. So Google have been experimenting with using PaLM, the Pathways Language Model, as an interface for robots. DeepMind are also using offline training in virtual environments to train robots to perform tasks, and then uploading those programs directly into robots. They did this with I think I've got a demo here, something called Sim to Soccer. These are tiny little football playing robots that DeepMind trained first in a virtual environment and then in a zero-shot trials. They didn't fine-tune them on having real bodies. They just uploaded these programs directly, these models directly into robot bodies, and found they could play football pretty well and kind of cute.
Look at that. Oh my goodness. They've got a pretty good kick on them, can still get quite a good game.
A soccer match at DeepMind looks like fun and games, but here's the thing. Humans did not program these robots to play. They learned the game by themselves.
It's coming up with these interesting different strategies, different ways to walk, different ways to block.
And they're doing it. They're scoring over and over again.
This robot here.
Raya Hadsel, Vice President of Research and Robotics, showed us how engineers used motion capture technology to teach the AI program how to move like a human. But on the soccer pitch, the robots were told only that the object was to score. The self-learning program spent about 2 weeks testing different moves.
So again, that just recapitulated everything I just said, but basically, yeah, they were trained in virtual environments and then uploaded to the robotic bodies. So that was from about 5 months ago, 6 months ago. I think this is a really exciting area. So we will start to see some of this filtering into robotics. And the final thing I think that is going to be massively disruptive, and which is going to be the focus of my talk on Friday, is social AI. So some of you may be familiar with systems like Xiao Ice, which I believe is quite popular in China, but it's still quite rudimentary compared to the latest generations of dialogue agents we're seeing produced by the big tech companies. I think it's going to become increasingly common for young people, in particular, to start forming friendships and romances with AI assistants. And my prediction is that this is going to fundamentally change the way we think about consciousness. But that is all going to have to wait until, not next week, Friday, and when I'll go into this in more detail. Okay, so I'll wrap up there. Thanks very much for your attention. I look forward to hearing any thoughts and replies, including from my commentator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. That was amazing. Just a tour de force, very inspiring, super informative presentation and discussion there. Now, I wouldn't know where to begin. I have so many things I want to talk to you about. So I am very happy that I don't have to make that decision, because we are very lucky to have Wang Yuzhou, my colleague from the Department of Philosophy at Beida, with us to start the discussion for us. I will very briefly introduce him for our audience. Wang Yuzhou is an assistant professor in the philosophy department at Peking University. More specifically, he's in our research and teaching section for the philosophy of science and technology. He graduated from Bowling Green State University last year, 2022, with a thesis on the epistemology of moral disagreements. He's interested and he's published papers in a number of different areas in the analytic tradition, with a focus on the ethics of science and technology, bioethics, and more generally, moral epistemology. His current research focuses on the ethics of human enhancement, social robots, and deception, and morality in virtual reality. All right, over to you, Yuzhou. Welcome and thank you.
All right, thanks, Sebastian, for the introduction, and yeah, thanks, Henry, for the wonderful talk. I found it very informative and also very thought-provoking. And so let me just, so I have so many questions, so same with Sebastian, but just to save some time for discussion, let me just maybe start with 3 of the questions or comments I have. And so the first thing that I found kind of very interesting, where you talked about the metaphysical critiques, or like your critique of those metaphysical critiques. I find it interesting because for me, I always thought that those metaphysical questions are kind of important, and but maybe you disagree with that, because I find it important because, you know, it is not just metaphysical, but it can have some ethical implications, for example, about the moral standing or the moral status of AI. So if AI has those has consciousness or understanding, or maybe more importantly, if they are sentient, then maybe they have a well-being or a moral standing, and it can matter to our decision making in ethics, and maybe we need to protect their well-being rather than just to privilege the well-being of human beings. So I think those metaphysical questions are quite important. I don't think that it can be like easily dismissed. So that's one thing that I think it's maybe I want to hear more about your thoughts on. And the second one is it's where you talk about the AI is very good at convincing people, and it can maybe replace jobs such as of the salesman, for example. And in particular, I'm also very interested in that there's a related problem of Eliza effect, where people can have these emotional bonds with AI, and that makes it more easier for AI to actually convince people if people trust them and people likes them. And I think one ethical problem I'm worried about that is that it can cause some sort of manipulation of person and can affect people's autonomy. So maybe like AI can actually manipulate people to do certain things for it, and or maybe like other people can use AI to manipulate others. So for example, maybe currently we have this kind of commercials on like Google searches where companies can pay Google to make their commercials appear on a search result. Maybe in the future, like GPT can also have those commercials emerged into them, and companies can pay the AI companies to have the GPT convince the users to buy their product. And I think that is something that may be very worrisome. And again, I would like to hear a little bit of your thought on that. And yeah, and third, the third problem is you mentioned early in the talk about this sigmoid curve, and you think that there will be a technological plateau for artificial intelligence. So my worry is that will there ever be such a plateau, or will it maybe just grow exponentially indefinitely? Just like the singularity theory says that there will not be any plateau, and maybe it's also related to the problem of the existential risks. So whether you think maybe it is like an emerging problem we need to think about. Maybe we are just at the beginning of some kind of singularity. So that's all my questions, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts on those questions.
Thank you so much, Yujo. Those are three brilliant questions. I'm going to say, I will say at the start, questions 1 and 2 definitely get more attention in the talk I'm giving on Friday. I'll answer them now, but I also hope you'll be able to join for that, so you'll get the sort of detailed answers there. So yes, first, regarding metaphysical questions, why should we care? Well, I think I was a bit glib in saying, who cares? Well, I care because I'm a philosopher of mind. What I have been a bit surprised by is how, if I'm running a business, or if even if I'm a legislator worried about things like privacy and autonomy or AI models, I think these metaphysical questions aren't so relevant for those topics. However, I completely agree that at least in principle, they are relevant for ethical questions and robot rights, as it's sometimes called, the debate about whether AI systems deserve any ethical considerations. However, even there, I suspect that the philosophical or metaphysical considerations won't end up mattering all that much. I'll explain briefly, but so by way of background, my PhD advisor was Peter Godfrey Smith, philosopher of science, and he's very skeptical of AI. And I didn't work on AI during my PhD with him. I worked on animal minds. And whenever we see each other, because we still see each other a couple of times a year, he's very skeptical about AI and thinks that no AI system will ever be conscious. And one thing I've told him is that you realize, Peter, that even if you're right, you're on the wrong side of history. That our children and our grandkids will obviously treat AI systems as conscious because they will have human level capabilities. They'll be able to talk like us, interact with us, socialize with us. And even if you're right that there's going to be no inner light of consciousness there, it won't matter because they'll have all the capabilities associated with that. And those capabilities are enough to get us to empathize with them and treat them as if they were conscious beings. I think that's going to be particularly true when you think about young people, teenagers growing up, interacting with AI girlfriends and boyfriends, which is something I talk a lot more about on Friday. I think it seems to me that I can already say with high confidence which way that debate is going to go. even if some philosophers remain unconvinced. Now, for my part, I should say, I'm pretty open-minded about AI consciousness. I think, although probably no AI systems are currently conscious, I think probably within the next decade, we'll see the first genuine conscious AI systems. But as I say, I think in a way, the opinions of experts, philosophers, cognitive scientists won't matter all that much. The capabilities alone will settle the ethical questions.
Right.
So on to the second point, I think that's a really, really good, really serious concern about manipulation. I think the power of these systems in things like sales, I could be proven wrong here, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if certainly by the end of this decade, the best human salespeople can't compete with AI systems. Again, I say a bit more about this on Friday, and I think, but I think the worry is even bigger than just manipulation. There's the problem that these systems can't be value neutral. You know, if I go to ChatGPT and ask it a provocative political question, it will give me an answer. It has to. Even if that answer is to say, oh, well, that's a complicated question. So if I say, for example, I don't know, is climate change real, right? It will have to give some answer, whether that is, of course, it's real, or, well, people disagree, or something. These systems are built as dialogue agents, and even declining to answer has a valued component. If it says, oh, I don't answer controversial questions, right? That's telling you that it's a controversial question. So I think regardless of whether people try and build these systems to be manipulative, which of course they will, even with the best intentions, if we try and make them neutral, we're still taking a stand in terms of values. And so I think that's a really big problem. I guess I should flag that, you know, more broadly, no technology, or arguably no technology, is totally value neutral. You know, you already see this. Google have to prioritize which search results come first, which come second, and so forth. Wikipedia editors have to decide what a good source is, what a bad source is. So, okay, this is not strictly a new problem, but I think as we come to trust these systems more and more and anthropomorphize them, treat them as humans, and become to trust them, then even if their creators did have good intentions, there's still going to be a lot of values that are imparted to us in our communications with them. And finally, yeah, the third one, right? So will there ever be such a plateau? Well, I'm reminded, I'm sure it's something that's occurred to most people. You know, you think you have 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, and quickly you realize that if you go back far enough, you have more grandparents than there were people in the world. And of course, you know, it's because not everyone's great-grandparents are distinct and so forth. And some of your great-great-great-grandparents would have been married to each other and so forth, right? But I mean, one lesson from that is that exponential growth can't go on. If you've got an exponential sequence in the real world, it can't go on forever. That said, I think there's a serious possibility that by the time AI hits the technological plateau, it will be after it has exhausted all usable materials within our light cone. So, in other words, have basically turned the entire universe into copies of itself or paperclips or whatever. I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen. There has to be, I'd say there has to be some plateau. That plateau may be too far down the line to be any comfort to humans.
I see.
But great questions. Thank you so much, Richard.
Oh no, thank you. Yeah, it's I'm looking forward to your talk on Friday. Great, thanks. Yeah.
Great, Ijo, you're welcome to respond if you want to, just so you know.
Yeah, I think it's those are very good answers. I'm just maybe I'll ask more questions on Friday, right? So I think for now we can just give the rest of time to others to ask questions.
Sure. Okay, excellent. Well, thanks to both of you for that wonderful short dialogue and exchange. So yes, I can see that those who know how to do it are already raising their hands, but I should explain to everyone else who may not be aware of how we run the discussion, how to suggest that they would like to talk, ask a question, make a comment. Everyone in the Zoom meeting anyway is welcome to speak up. We'll have to open your mic though, so please, if you can use the reaction function to raise your hand in the way that someone's doing it already. If you don't know how to do it, you can also just write in the chat. hey, I'd like to say something, okay, and then I'll know, and I might ask you to do so. Open your mic, open your video if you like. I should also mention that we are on various live streams, so we're monitoring the live stream chats. You can ask questions there, and we'll try to pass them on to our speaker. Okay, great. So there is a first hand that I've seen, which is Christian Wenzels, professor at National Taiwan University. Very welcome to ask this question. I will ask you to unmute and to open your video if you like. Christian, welcome.
Okay.
Hi,
Can you
Christian.
hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello, Henry. Yeah, thank you for your talk, which was very dense and very good. I liked it. My question is about this. I like the idea of this sigmoid function and the idea of a plateau. And so we are somewhere in where it goes up and we wonder, where are we? And so what we notice is, like in Europe, like a friend in Europe just told me that some schools begin to be kind of go back. They use less technology, AI stuff, because they noticed like people can't write properly anymore. People can't do the right arithmetic anymore. And this friend of mine told me that in the Northern European countries, which are often more, I don't know, a little bit ahead, they really go back. They want to use less of that because they see some kind of some loss in ability. So that's one issue. And similarly, regarding I mean, maybe I'm on the wrong side again, as you were saying. How much do we want to use this? So we have a lot of technology, but people still like to have a garden and grow a plant and water it like people did hundreds of years ago. For some, their kind of well-being, they want to do it themselves. They don't want to get it ready-made. They want to have the experience. Maybe even if it's time-consuming, or maybe it's really, maybe even it's painful. I don't know, but you just get a feeling of success. So I mean, kind of AI is a lot about optimizing, but then we might want to withdraw sometime because we cherish, I don't know what. I don't want to always say consciousness. But we want to kind of do something ourselves. Like maybe an experience I had is that in school, I didn't learn poems by heart, but my parents did. And when I was like 40, I realized that I missed something. So I made an effort to memorize some poems. And when you're 40, you're not good at that, but I managed. And I had the experience, so I learned it with like French poetry or Chinese poetry. And I had the experience that by making the effort of memorizing it, I understand it. And I found that before, just by reading, I haven't really understood it. So these are kind of self-centered, first-person perspective experiences people cherish, and that might have an effect on the sigmoid function. That's a thought I had while I was listening to your talk. Yeah.
No, so loads of really interesting points there, and a huge amount I agree with. So I think it's important when thinking about the impact of AI on the world of work or our professional lives or our economy, to think also about what we ultimately want it to deliver in terms of our personal lives. And I think there is an answer that I would probably endorse, which is I would like to see as much of the world of work or the mundane parts of the world of work automated so that we can focus on the kinds of activities that bring us pleasure, bring us satisfaction. For a silly example, I spend a ridiculous amount of time when I can't sleep at night. I watch these wonderful traditional metal working videos where people do stuff like make a saw by hand, and it's a beautiful process to watch. And I would love to have time to do that kind of thing. And my hope, and I think the hope of some sort of futurists, is that once we can hand over sort of everyday production, most of the tools of the economy over to AI systems, we'll have more leisure time for doing this kind of thing. Now, of course, a lot of people hoped, even in the early 20th century, that industrialization would allow us to have very short work weeks, and that, you know, I think John Maynard Keynes said he thought most people wouldn't have to work more than a few hours a week by the end of the 20th century. And of course, that didn't come true. So I don't know if it's entirely realistic to hope for that, but that would be my goal. That rather than us becoming one with the machine takes over the tasks that we don't want to do, so that we can actually explore more fundamental human goods, becoming experts in domains, not because we want to do so to make money, but because it brings us satisfaction, whether that's beautiful calligraphy or metalworking or woodwork or growing a garden. These are what I think of as really the most profound goods in my life, if I'm honest. So just to also link that back to your question about schools. So there's absolutely, I think it's a real concern that technology prompts de-skilling. This is a term you're probably familiar with that comes up in a lot of sort of occupational psychology, often raised in relation to things like airline pilots who become so reliant on autopilot systems that when autopilot fails, they're unable to fly the plane correctly. This has often been brought up in relation to the Air France crash that happened in the South Atlantic some 15, 20 years ago. And the pilots, once the tools that they were so used to stopped responding, that they weren't able to fly the plane without them. And I think we have similar worries about education. If students use ChatGPT to write all their essays, such that they're unable to structure their thoughts in writing, maybe they'll be losing fundamental cognitive skills. And I think that is a real concern. I guess one question would be, some skills we think are less important than others. So for example, my parents' generation were taught to write cursive and to write in these quite elaborate styles. I wasn't. I was taught to write in joined up handwriting, but not in these very fancy scripts. Was I missing out on something important? Maybe, maybe not. Another example, I don't know how much it applies to sort of the Chinese writing system, but a friend of mine who works in Japan was telling me that because everyone uses text, uses either phones or computers now, a lot of people are very bad at writing some of the more complicated characters, that this was a skill that was dropping out of the general population when they had to write them freehand. So I think an important question we have to ask is, are these skills worth preserving? Should they be something that we require everyone to learn? Or should they just be considered, an optional thing for those who want to do them? I think handwriting, I would probably say, should be an optional thing. I'm not so clear on essay writing. It seems to me that structuring your thoughts in writing is such a fundamental part of thinking. Very often I don't even know what I want to say until I've written a first draft of a paper. And then there's a sort of dynamic relationship between me and the words on the page that helps me formulate my thoughts. And I think losing that skill could be very bad for thinking and cognition. But this is the kind of area where I think we should be careful. And I think probably we need a lot more empirical work, a lot more psychological work to explore what the effects of this kind of loss of skills amount to.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you very much, Christian.
Yes, thank you, Christian, and thank you, Henry, for your response. Now, I don't see more hands in the Zoom meeting right now. More hands welcome. So I'll use that as an opportunity to bring in some questions from the live stream. And I'll try to summarize them and give them a personal twist. So there's two types here. One concerns the long-term questions of existential risk, and also long-term opportunity, which is something that I think we also need to think more and more about, particularly when, some people now are quite worried about existential risk. Let's also think about the good side. Okay, and the other type of question concerns, in a broad sense, interdisciplinarity. Not only in the way of your view on how perhaps in particular people working in the humanities can effectively collaborate with their colleagues in science and engineering, to have an impact that perhaps seems an important impact that is required, but also for students. So let me start with this type of question. So here's a sort of a concrete side to it. Someone asks, as a philosophy student who's interested in AI, I feel that it's hard to catch up, right? What's your advice? So I think here's a question which is, for those working on sort of the humanities side of the spectrum, philosophy in particular, ethics perhaps, just how much technical knowledge is required? Should we first study an MA in computer science and AI to be able to engage in these questions? Or what is your view on that? Okay, and perhaps let me just add the concrete side to the other type of question, which was about the long term. There, someone asked in particular, they said they would like to hear more about how AI might help improve the state of social justice in the world. Very interesting question, I think. Okay, so I hope that I made clear what the two types of questions are, and you can take them in turn. And if you want to check exactly what were those questions again, just ask me. Okay.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll start running through some of those really interesting points, all of them. And if there are any that I miss, remind me to go back to them, although I did make some notes. So I'll start with this practical question of, so firstly, I would say I think this is the most exciting time to be a philosopher possibly ever. I think there are so many urgent questions that absolutely need philosophical skills that are about as close to new questions as you ever face in philosophy. Previous generations of technology have given new spins to old questions, but I think we're in the process of creating the first non-human intelligent agents ever. And I think that creates a whole host of issues that we have never faced before. So, and I think those issues are complex, myriad. I think this is, I really am just so overwhelmed by the amount of useful work that needs to be done. So if you're a philosopher interested in AI, I would say it's an incredible time of opportunities. But what about the technical barriers? Well, the first thing I would say, I think right now, the technical barriers are possibly lower than they've ever been. And let me explain what I mean by that. I think there was a time when the kind of algorithms that were relevant for AI, the kind of tools that we used, in order to understand those algorithms properly, you would need a strong background in coding. You would probably need to know Python. You would need to be able to have, you'd need to have a good grasp of statistics. I think in order to understand, and that's because these algorithms were only used by specialists. But now we're in a world in which everyone, well, not everyone, but very large numbers of people can use ChatGPT. And I think a useful analogy here is cars and driving and mechanics. So I think maybe you might think, if I'm going to have any thoughts about driving, about cars, I need to know how internal combustion engines work. I need to know how spark plugs work in order to advise on road safety, for example. But of course you don't, but you might need to know how to drive. And driving here is knowing how things like ChatGPT work, or how they work on the user end, what kind of things you can ask them, what kind of outputs they give you. You don't need to know exactly how the system works down to every line of code. Maybe a little bit of technical knowledge would help, but it's not essential. But understanding the patterns of interaction that happen between users in these systems, looking at how different groups, different ages, different genders, different linguistic groups, how they interact with these systems, the kind of problems they create. This is all useful work that doesn't require any specialized knowledge, but it does require you to spend time playing with these systems yourself. I have learned far more just from playing with ChatGPT, playing with Stable Diffusion, trying different queries than I've ever learned from reading technical papers about how transformers work, at least in terms of lessons that are relevant for me as a philosopher. So I strongly advise you, don't be scared of the technical side. Maybe if you're interested in that, you can get to it eventually, but definitely get involved in the user experience of these systems. And that's something that doesn't require technical knowledge. Finally, I should probably also add on that note, I mentioned I was I did my PhD working on animal minds. And so back relatively recently, 2016, before I moved to Cambridge, my knowledge of AI was no deeper than that expected of a typical philosopher of mind. But it's such an exciting area. And I think if you can channel your inner passion and enthusiasm for it, learning about it will quickly stop feeling like work. So, usually the first thing I do these days when I sign off work for the day is check what's going on AI Twitter, and I'll say, oh, cool, someone's dropped a new model. Oh, interesting, it has this problem. So I think if you do feel that passion, and maybe it doesn't necessarily have to come straight away, it may require a bit of engagement first, then you'll find yourself learning very rapidly. And I actually also, a final thought on that is I also think because the field is moving so fast, it's no longer the case that in order to understand it, or in order to understand the state of the art, you need to read 20 textbooks, right? Because those textbooks haven't been written yet, and they probably never will be written. The most exciting, the most relevant stuff in AI is usually a series of tweets by Jan LeCun, or a new paper that's just been uploaded to arXiv 5 minutes ago. And so much of the stuff that was written 2 or 3 years ago is already out of date. So I think it's one of the exciting things about being in a rapidly changing field, which is that there's not this huge mountain of scholarship you need to climb in order to engage with what's new, because we're building new and bigger mountain ranges all the time. So that's my answer to the philosophical question about how to engage more. And I guess that I'd also add what I said for philosophy goes for other fields in a huge way. And I think CFI, where my institute is based, we have people from a wide range of backgrounds: sociology, history, comparative literature, English literature, working on all sorts of fascinating projects. And I think everything from how AI is portrayed in fiction in different countries to the ways that religion intersects with AI. And I think for all of the humanities, this is a gold mine of interesting, exciting new questions to explore. And I think it's really important that all the humanities engage. I guess one thing I would say, though, is, this is not the last word, but you can see I'm going to say something a little bit controversial. I think a lot of the humanities have tended to take a very negative attitude towards the technology, and that's important. That is important, that you have critics in the room as well. But what I would like to see more of is positive visions. If we get AI right, what could that look like? How might AI, to go back to another question, how might AI improve social justice? And there are some people working on this, but I think a lot of the humanities have a default pessimism or a default negativity. And again, that is important, but we also want that to be counterbalanced. So regarding how AI could improve social justice, I think this is a really important and very interesting question. I think 2 examples of ways in which it could do so are healthcare and education. Maybe I'll start with healthcare, since that's most straightforward. Obviously, huge parts of the world have very limited access to healthcare. In countries like the UK, where we do have healthcare for everyone, the system is already under strain. Costs are rising as we face an aging population, as China, of course, does, and many other developed countries do around the world. And having things like easy, fast, free diagnostic medicine that's readily accessible through tools like ChatGPT, I think could be very useful and help reduce costs and reduce inequalities in access to high-quality healthcare. In education, I'm even more excited. So there's a finding from a famous educational psychologist, Benjamin Bloom, from the 1980s, sometimes called Bloom's 2 sigma problem. And this is the discovery, discovery's maybe not the right word. Bloom showed through a series of studies that students who had one-to-one tuition performed 2 standard deviations higher in terms of retention and understanding of material than students who were taught in a group setting. And this should be obvious, right? There's a reason people pay for private tutors, because private tutors that can answer and clear up every individual query, that is a far better way of learning and producing understanding than sitting in a huge classroom. And already, I think ChatGPT can provide that role. It provides that role for me. I've been using it as a tutor for chemistry, for example. I was never a good chemistry student at school, so I had big gaps in my knowledge. So using GPT-4, I asked it to produce a course for me. And I did so. First, I asked it to do a needs analysis. I asked it to quiz me on what I already knew, and it helped identify gaps in my knowledge. And then it produced a course to fill those gaps. And as I go along, I can ask follow-up questions, say, hold on, so ionic bonding is like this, and it can correct me. So I think education is going to be one of the areas where everyone should hopefully be able soon to have access to the kind of private tutor experience that only the very rich could afford. So that's a slight answer, a partial answer to that. There are lots of other interesting dimensions. And I encourage those who are interested in that question to also look at the publications of my colleagues at CFI, many of whom work specifically on social justice. And finally, third part of the question on thinking about long-term goods. long-term risks and long-term goods. So to echo something I said earlier on, I think there's an overabundance of pessimism. I think, as I said, pessimism is important, but I think what we need more of is positive visions of what it looks like if we get AI right. I wrote an editorial about this. If anyone wants to read it, just Google my name and "What if AI saves the planet?" I didn't choose the title, but I talk about how we need more positive visions for AI. And for me, I think the kind of dream scenario is one that's been explored in the science fiction, by the work of Ian M. Banks, whose culture books, they're called, the culture series of books, envision a world in which AI acts as sort of the guardian angels or caretakers of humanity, enabling humans to live the kinds of lives that Christian was mentioning, where we can explore our natural talents and abilities without having to worry about material needs because we're looked after by AI systems. That's one example of a positive vision, but I'd love to see more that are explored. What does it mean when we have superhuman colleagues or allies that can help look after us or foster the very best of human thriving? Okay, so I'll stop there for now.
Wonderful stuff. So I think we have time for one more exchange, and I can see another hand in our Zoom meeting. So I want to call on Varvara Yureva. I will ask you to unmute yourself. Got your video there. All right, welcome.
Oh, thank you. I actually want to ask a question about the ethics of AI, because you were talking about how we can use AI, for example, in healthcare. And I think one of the biggest problems with healthcare is that when there is a mistake, we have a person responsible for it. Like if a doctor makes a mistake during the operation or something goes wrong, we have a person to blame. But what happens if, for example, AI does this thing and something goes wrong, or we cannot really predict what is going to happen next? Who is to blame and whose responsibility is it? It also, this question is also about this very controversial statements of AI, because we cannot really say that it's the responsibility of the developers because they didn't put it inside the system. But how do we manage this problem?
Excellent. Yeah, really rich questions. Thank you, Varvara. In short, I think different contexts are going to require different liability and responsibility regimes. This may sound a strange analogy, but I think we have one other example where we're dealing with non-human agents, which is in things like law concerning domesticated animals. You know, if my dog runs off the leash and bites someone, we have existing legal rules to deal with that. So it's not impossible for legal systems to find ways of determining who is responsible when dealing with non-human agents who may not themselves be held responsible. One thing that I think is probably important, though, is I think it would be a mistake to start prematurely assigning responsibility to AIs themselves. I think we're a very long way from being in a situation where it would make practical moral sense to hold AIs accountable for their actions. I say that partly given my views in sort of moral philosophy, that I think one of the reasons we praise and blame people is to condition their future behavior. One reason we hold people accountable, I'm thinking some of you may know Peter Strawson's essay, Freedom and Resentment, a big influence on me, that the reason we punish people in part is to shape behavior and attitudes of the public at large. And for now, and even for the foreseeable future, AI is simply too different from us, both in its constitution and how it interacts socially, that I think it wouldn't make sense. It would be counterproductive to hold AI systems responsible. So my advice to anyone in the legal realm would be, you still need a human you can hold accountable for these actions. That said, I'll maybe add one little other final thought here, which is, I think sometimes there is a risk of being too risk averse when thinking about AI systems. So specifically in the case of driverless cars, I think there's growing evidence that driverless cars, based on performance so far in the recent performance, are approaching the point where they're safer than human drivers. But they might still make mistakes that a human wouldn't make. And when we look at that, right, it's easy to be freaked out. You might say, okay, this driverless car has driven 100,000 miles and had significantly fewer accidents than a human would driving 100,000 miles. But it made this one mistake that no human would ever make. I think we should resist the temptation. My view in that case is to accept that the pattern of mistakes that AI makes is going to be a bit different from the pattern of mistakes that humans make. And we, rather than focusing on the quality of mistake, we should look at the total incidence of mistakes and the total harms they inflict. So as a way I put this in discussion with students, right? If you're given a choice of, if you're going for some serious operation and you can have a human surgeon or an AI surgeon, and you learn the human surgeon, 95% of his patients survive, or her patients survive. The AI, 99% the AI's patients survive. But 1 in every 1,000 times, the AI will just go crazy and slash you up or do something no human surgeon would ever do. But you'll be under general anesthetic, so it won't make any difference to you. Which would you choose? And my students do have different intuitions on this, but my intuition is, of course, you go with the AI. It's the numbers that matter, right? I'll take 99% over 95% every time. So that would be my sort of the one qualifier I would say. I think rather than focusing always on the quality of mistake, focus on the quantity of mistake. But anyway, lovely question. Thank you, Barbara.
Yes, thank you, Barbara, and thanks, Henry, for a lovely answer. Super interesting. I'd love to continue, love to get more of my own questions in finally, but everyone's had so many that now it's already time to end for today. But well, we're lucky enough to be able to look forward to Friday, right? In 2 days, starting at the same time as today's lecture, there will be Henry's second lecture. That's going to take us into the direction, some directions that we've been exploring with him today already. The title is The Inevitability of AI Consciousness. So we're looking forward to that. For now, I'd like to thank everyone again. Thanks, first of all, of course, to Henry, but also to our official respondent, my colleague Wang Yuzhou. Many thanks for getting the discussion started for us. Thanks to everyone else in the audience, the live stream on Zoom, particularly those who asked questions and helped make this a super interesting discussion, which we'll continue in 2 days. So we'll look forward to that. Looking forward to your second lecture, Henry, and thank you again.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you, Yuzhou, and thank you to everyone who asked the question. It's been a real pleasure being here, and I'm excited that I'll be back. So if anyone in the live stream, for example, didn't have their questions answered, I'll be happy to take further questions on today's talk on Friday then as well.